As you'll see, this is being recorded, and we suggest you probably stop your video and please make sure you've muted your mic for the duration. There's a chat facility here on Zoom. I'm sure you've got a load of questions, so please don't hesitate. Put your questions into the chat. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sibylle Steimen, who's the Managing Director Advisory of Services at Allianz Re, who will tell us a little bit about the importance of data standards. Sibylle, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you from my side. As mentioned, I'm working at Allianz Re, member of the board there, and I have been part of the insurance and reinsurance industry now for approximately 17 years. Since my first day on the job, I can say data standards were in one or the other way part of my professional career. In my role as a CAT analyst, I have received many more or less orderly Excel sheets from our cedents. A big proportion of my job was to interpret, validate, and then translate the data into a format that vendor models are able to understand. While this was definitely good to get the first idea about the importance of data standards, I would say it was not the most exciting part of my job, looking back. But it motivated me to make things better. I spent quite some years developing, building, and rolling out a vendor-independent in-house data standard. But why did we go in-house? Guess what? There was no complete, ready-to-use, openly available, and vendor-independent data standard available at that time. During the time of project setup, I had to convince my stakeholders to invest in defining the standard and implementing it. I often used an analogy, which I would say is still valid. My mother tongue is Swiss German. I'm able to speak decent German, which I learned at school. And my business English, I would say, is fit for purpose, also acquired over many years. Now imagine a business world without English as a common language, where, I don't know, maybe 40% can speak English and 60% simply cannot. Imagine we would always need an interpreter in between the different languages. Wouldn't we lose speed and content of our business and the way we communicate with each other? And how would it be if there were only one or two interpreting firms available to help us communicate? Wouldn't this lead to undesired effects? Maybe the interpreters would not have the right vocabulary for new trends. Maybe we would need a chain of interpreters because one language could not be directly translated into another. What would the world be like if we would not need interpretation? Better, right? Unlike languages, which we non-native speakers have to learn at school and on the job for many years, we can do much better with data standards. If we set them up, use them, make them freely available, and keep them up to date, they can help us to keep the communication going, avoid interpretation errors, and make our communication quicker and much more to the point. Open data standards like ODS for liability help us to build the foundation for risk assessment, underwriting, and modeling. They can be adjusted by the intelligence of many to capture new trends and keep the focus of underwriters and analysts where it belongs, on making the right business decisions and not trying to make the best out of messy data. Furthermore, it also helps model developers to focus on what we clients want them to focus on. Build the best possible models for us to make the best possible risk-based decisions. Thank you. I wish you a good event and hope you will use the new ODS standards widely in your internal and external business communication. Thanks. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Sibylle. That's a really great introduction. You raised some really crucial points, I think. While you're still on, if I could be permitted, could I please ask you a question? Do you think that data standards generally will help with the financial disclosures that insurers are being asked for, and that this perhaps ODS liability could be a beginning part of getting some standards for that?
I believe so, definitely, because it avoids, the interpretation level, as I mentioned in my introduction. I think a big proportion of what we do is really guessing, in a way, what is meant by certain things. And if we bank on solid and well understood data standards, and I think open data standards are the best possible way for a better understanding, they can definitely help us to make things easier.
That's terrific. Thank you very much indeed. So next on our agenda this afternoon is to really help you find out what is ODS. And on holiday in a caravan in a field, our Matt Donovan has some insights for you. Over to you, Matt. And thank you very much, Sibylle.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm just going to share my screen. So hi, everyone. And yeah, like Jeremy said, I'm in a caravan and it's 50-mile-an-hour winds outside. So if I suddenly get cut off, I might have been blown away, but I'm sure I'll get through it and my connection will hold. So hi, my name is Matt Donovan. I'm just going to spend a very short 4 or 5 minutes talking exactly what about ODS is. I appreciate some people on the call will know a bit more than others about what ODS is. So what is it? As Sibylle has alluded to in her great introduction, it's a open, completely open, accessible, free to use market standard initiative developed by the market for the market. So it's not owned by any single entity. It's not owned by Oasis. It is purely open and completely agnostic to across models and developers. And the idea is that it helps solve interoperability problems currently in the CAT modeling space specifically. And the idea is that great benefits will be seen, especially when it comes to data analytics across multiple vendors and transfer of data across the market. So it is a consistent data format for inputs to CAT models and outputs. So it's governed by a steering committee, and I'll talk a little bit about the steering committee after this, made up of attendees from CAT model vendors, insurers, reinsurers, brokers, and some tech companies. And at the moment, ODS encompasses the OED and ORD schemas, which is your open exposure and open results data. And everything, all information can be found on the GitHub repository. And again, I'll show you a bit of that in a couple of minutes, just to give you a sort of feel and flavor of what it looks like. So let's move screens. So the steering committee meets 3 or 4 times a year. It's represented by these companies here. And Oasis chair and create this standard, like I said, and we use the GitHub versioning format of the major minor patch updates. And on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis, any implementations or updates and general management of the live and latest version is reviewed by a small working group, a dynamic and dynamic small working group. And anything major that needs to go up to the steering committee is then reviewed and okayed and reviewed by the steering committee. So I just want to show you a little bit about of what the GitHub repository looks like. Some people may know GitHub generally, some people may not. This is it, really. This is the GitHub repository. It has all of the information you need for ODS. It's got some information on the structure, information on the different components, OED, ORD, some information on the governance and the sign-off process that we go through for the smaller, minor changes to the schema, and also, like I said, the major ones that have to be signed off by the steering committee. And like I said, we follow the semantics from GitHub on the releases and the tracking. So just a couple of things to show you. If we go into the OED folder, you've got all the information on OED, which is currently focused obviously on property, and we're all here today to talk about liability. There's a liability folder there for all of your information on the schema and what we've done for liability. I won't go into this now because Mathias from Renry is going to talk about this a bit more detail later. But before I sign off and hand it back to Jeremy, there's just a couple of features I think are quite important to show you about this. So if anyone's using ODS or OED specifically, and they have feedback or they have any updates or implementations they wish to submit, it's all done through issues. So issues, you essentially go and you will write a new issue, and all comments, ideas, dialogue is completely transparent to everyone, which is a good audit trail, and any implementations here will then be reviewed by the working group and yourself if you are the person that submitted the issue, and then, like I said, anything major will then go to the steering committee. But on the smaller day-to-day updates that won't cause breakages to the schema or to anyone using it, it's just reviewed through this, and the person yourselves who have submitted the issue are kept completely in the loop, and there's generally, how it's been working is there's a dialogue with everyone who wants to be involved in that. So that's the issues. And just finally, one last thing is the watch feature. So this is a really good way, once you've got your GitHub login, if you sign up to this, it's a really good way of keeping up to date with updates to ODS. So obviously, you know, we don't want multiple versions of this being out there. This is a good way of getting email notifications on any updates or any feeds or any issues that have been raised that can be emailed directly to you. And it's also customizable. So you can customize what notifications you want to see. I mean, I've got here all activity, so I get not so much bombarded, but I get emails for everything that's happening with the repository, but you can customize that. So that's it, really. That's all I was going to say. ODS, you know, completely open, model agnostic, and we, you know, we hope the adoption increases and you guys start using it. And with that, I'll hand back to Jeremy, and we'll get into a bit more stuff on ODS and liability. So I'll stop sharing. Thanks for listening.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. And for everybody, that's everything you wanted to know about ODS, but we're afraid to ask. So, and as I get it, then liability is just a branch, if you like, of open exposure data. And Matt, quick question. How long has it taken to get a liability data standard in place?
So, yeah, we started chipping away at this exactly 12 months ago, actually. It's, yeah, obviously something that, just to get the right people around the table talking about, you know, what is included and what should be supported, it takes a bit of time. So yeah, so we're just about a year. So it's good to have this and finally have something out there.
Thank you very much. And just as a reminder to everyone, particularly to Henry, yeah, absolutely. Please use the chat facility. Please put some questions out there. I'm sure you got some. So now, without further ado, I'd like to go on to the next section, which is talking about the benefits of the liability standard for the market. And first of all, I'd like to introduce Emma Watkins, who's Head of Exposure Management and Aggregation at Lloyd's. Emma.
Thanks, Jeremy. And thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm having a little bit of internet issues this afternoon, so please somebody shout if it all goes wrong and you can't hear me. So yes, my name's Emma Watkins, and my team's role at Lloyd's is to understand and control the market's catastrophe risk, including liability or casualty catastrophe risk. The first part of that is key here. Obviously, if we can't understand risk, we can't control it. And in order to truly understand risk, we, the market, need to know as much about it as possible. That's why, as Sibylle and I think Matt as well has already mentioned, in the property insurance and reinsurance markets, we've been using and sharing exposure data between market participants for many years now. And many people on this call will know how and why that is a wonderful thing to be able to do compared with where we were 20-ish ago. The details of every property insured and their unique characteristics all feed into pricing, catastrophe modelling and underwriting, ultimately portfolio management, capital modelling and potentially many other processes. The data is shared between insurers, insureds, brokers, insurers, reinsurers and retro underwriters. And to facilitate that and make that efficient, the market has coalesced around a small number of common formats, providing consistency and making it really easy for the data to be used in multiple tools. But for liability risk, we don't have that yet, or we do now. but we do need it. Before we can start truly understanding modeling liability risk, we really do need this data. And we need to enable market participants sharing this data, making it easier for it to be used in all of the important processes that go into running a business. So late last year at Lloyd's, we launched some minimum data requirements for exposure management in cyber and liability risk. Those were just 5 simple data points, which are not currently always shared and collected through the market, but which we think are the basic building blocks for understanding these sorts of risks. The liability open data standard means that these data points can be collected and then shared between market participants, creating a consistent data platform for the market. And this can be done easily, efficiently, and no time and energy needs to be spent cleaning data, interpreting data, reformatting data. And ultimately then that data can be imported into the tools that are used by underwriters, modelers, actuaries, or anyone else who needs to understand risk. So that's why at Lloyd's we hope to see widespread adoption of the ODS, because it's really important to improving the understanding of liability risk throughout the market. Thanks, Jeremy.
Emma, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. So I know this is new on the liability side, but is it a really big thing for you? Would it really help?
Part of your question there.
Yeah, the question for you, Emma, sorry, I know that the internet is breaking a little bit.
Internet connection altogether.
Emma, maybe we'll ask that question towards the end. It was a question to find out how big of a deal this is to you in terms of the reporting for Lloyd's. I know it's new, but it does sound like this is going to be quite crucial for the future. In terms of what else it means for the market, we are very pleased to have David Arthur, who's going to give us a broker's view. David is head of non-specialty actuarial at Carpenter. David, over to you.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm just going to share a brief slide to give some context for what I'm talking about. So it's only going to be a single slide that I'm going to talk through, but I think I'm hopefully going to be talking about fairly similar things to that which Emma has just outlined from the perspective of Lloyd's, but from our perspective within the market as a broker, and also I guess for insureds and reinsurers as well. There's a number of reasons why data standards are beneficial to the market and can provide that benefit through a number of different ways. So I'm going to firstly focus a little bit on sort of process efficiency, and I guess that to a lot of people on the call, there's plenty of things that you could talk about with regard to efficiency. So not just the way that we're actually gathering data is often one of the things that takes longer than any of the analytics or interpretation that we may be able to do. In order to enhance the analytics, to spend more time on that, and being better able to turn data from its raw format into something which you can use is a great way to free up and build that understanding. And the ease of actually handling the data through having a standard format would be a significant driver of efficiency within the market. I guess also having a single defined data standard will also allow the development internally, or so within Guy Carpenter, for example, we would like to sort of develop tools in order to convert information from one standard into formats which are usable in models which we may have. And it's really very difficult to do that without a common sense or common definition of data points to allow that sort of automation of information handling to be applied. And it equally makes things like repeat work much more efficient. It also allows the use of information from either new clients or from the market's perspective for new assureds. It allows a greater speed of analysis and a more accurate way of getting to the grips with exactly what those clients are providing. In addition to the efficiency benefit, there's also the data accuracy point. So having a data standard allows insureds to understand what's actually required from them, and in terms of being able to limit the degree to which different fields can be interpreted, it also means there's less room for error and a greater sense of control over the sorts of information that's provided over the course of the renewal process. In terms of that data accuracy, that kind of leads on to this shared understanding issue. So where we are able to get a quick sense of exactly what's contained within the data because the fields are well defined and well understood, it means also that we can develop a shared understanding which can be both the insured, the reinsurer, and the broker in each stage, so that there's actually a fairly quick process to be able to get to a point where we can actually discuss issues around the information that's being provided. We also can develop that common understanding as to why data is required, and then beyond there to get to actually conversations around the outputs from the analytics, rather than simply going through the cycle of why this source of data doesn't match that source of data and such like. In terms of that shared understanding, I guess that the sort of benefit of this data standard is that it kind of builds that foundation, which is then this market intelligence that we have more so on the property side at the moment. And I think Guy Carpenter are a supporter of the other data standards, the OED standards that have been developed, and are using that at the moment within our client base for property lines of business. But for liability, that sort of basic foundation that I think Emma talked about a little bit doesn't exist to the same extent. So where in the property market there's more definition and more common understanding about exactly what data is required for, what data is being used for, and why reinsurers may ask for such information. In terms of actually the way that the standard here can be used, we would be able to develop a foundation for what exactly insurers or reinsurers would like to do with the information, so that we can have that sort of foundation for developing ways to actually interpret the information that's being given. And I guess that once we've got that foundation of a common data standard around more basic fields, we obviously then, it's a smaller step then to go from having a common understanding to being able to do more analytics in terms of exposure information around the sorts of things that I guess as a broker we'd be delighted to be able to do to add real value to clients, to understand the world of risk in the liability class of the business that we work in. And in order to try and do that, it's a lot easier to do that from this kind of common definition, to be able to develop those tools off the back of that. So I guess that's sort of a very quick overview about the sort of benefits that we see that the market would be able to gain, and ourselves too. And I guess with that, I'll hand back to Jeremy for the next step.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Do you think it's going to be the broker or the carrier that's going to help this as to be a success in the market for people to adopt these standards?
In terms of who, I guess it's going to be always, as with everything, it's going to be a bit of a mixture, because to a degree it's going to be something which we would require carriers to be able to buy into. So if they're able to actually, if they're keen to use it, then it's something that we would be obviously incentivized to provide. And equally, in terms of having a standard view, if everybody has that standard view, it makes it much easier from our perspective. So there is a bit of synergy involved in exactly who is going to drive that process.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, next up, we're going to be looking at the key benefits of a liability standard from a model user perspective. And it's with great pleasure I'd like to introduce Robin Wilkinson, who's MD and Vice President Casualty Analytics at now Verisk. Robin, we were chewing over NAICS and various versions of that quite some time ago.
Yes, don't the wheels turn slowly, Jeremy? But thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here, and I'm pleased that we've got to this state of looking at a liability standard. And I want to talk about the benefits, particularly in the context of our liability accumulation tool called Arium. So we very much welcome this standard, and I'll go into a little bit more detail, if I may, just to explain why it's so useful for the modeling. So there are two aspects, I think, that are particularly useful for Arium. One is just standardizing the policy details, and the other is the standardizing of the liability taxonomy. This is for all these different liability lines of business. Now, I think Mathias, who's going to be speaking soon, is going to be sharing some of the details of what we came up with. But I just wanted to highlight some aspects that I think we find particularly relevant for us. So on the policy details, the way it's been done is that the different policy details have been graded in terms of importance. And those that are like essential or highly recommended fields, it's not too extensive a list. It's quite, to me, manageable, and it covers all the key information needed in Arium. So although to put data into Arium, we have slightly different names, we can easily produce a mapping table for clients so you can map between fields. That means it can be, you know, immediately usable by anyone doing the ODS. They can just kind of plug and play their data into Arium. The only thing I would say here is that liability modeling, as people know, is now exposure-based. And so risk characteristics are needed. And so the standard is covering not just general policy terms, but also what we think are the core risk characteristics to get meaningful output. And those are essentially information on the nature of the business you're writing, or industry code, and also the size, which is revenue. We also use employee numbers in Arium, but revenue is great, you know, of all the businesses you're writing. So these are core risk characteristics, but they're frequently missing currently from a lot of insurers' portfolios. So if people see that in the standard, they shouldn't worry, because even though it might not be available in your portfolios, we have a process, and I know, you know, others do as well, to append these together with unique corporate identifiers, so clients can just supply the standard essential ODS standard data with like just company name and country, and we append the missing characteristic fields. So I think it's very, very well done in the standard to specify that that information is needed, but be clear that you don't actually have to have it to run a model if you provide that core information of name and country. So that's really useful. So on the lines of business, this has been really helpful for us to have, agreed standard liability taxonomy. So as you know, our model Arium covers like all liability lines of business. And without a standard, every client, really had their own coding. And clients are running global portfolios, and the coding isn't even consistent within the client's total portfolio, let alone between different portfolios. And so it's really almost painstaking then to map it into a standard, liability taxonomy. But the great thing now is if they're using, the taxonomy come up with here, it mirrors all our lines of business at the high level. It fits really well. And so Arium can be used, with more confidence that you've actually got the right line of business if you've actually using already the ODS liability taxonomy. And one of the things that really helps with is it really reduces the lead time to using the tool. So when you're all ready and you go, wow, I want to start doing my modeling, and then you have to deal with managing your data and looking at the lines of business, working on the policy, it can just set you back a little bit when you want to be doing these things more quickly. So it's really great if you're using these standards. It just speeds up the entire process. So in summary, what we think this ODS can do is help with long-term improvement in data capture. And as other speakers have been saying, really circulating data around the market and providing consistent treatment of portfolios, because as they get aggregated for internal regulatory reinsurance purposes, at least you're dealing with like for like on a consistent basis. And I think it's been a really good standard because I think it's simple enough to be readily usable and adopted across the market. So it's not so complex, people might throw up their hands, but I think hopefully, and we very much hope people will widely adopt this, and we think it's a really great step forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you especially for, I know, all the work you've been doing behind the scenes to bring this together over the last year. Much appreciated. What I've always found extraordinary myself is the naming conventions that we find across the market. It's extraordinary, even with a simple and well-known name like Rolls-Royce, you could spell it multiple ways.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Robin. Jessica Schuler is the SVP Strategy and Data Analytics at Praedicat, and has had to step in at very short notice. So we're extremely grateful for you, Jessica, to be able to give us a few more insights from a model user perspective. Over to you.
Great, well, thank you. And thanks to OASIS for putting together this practical liability standard. Praedicat certainly supports the standards and intends to encourage it with our clients. As liability insurers face social inflation, really now is the best time to invest in data so that reinsurers and insurers can manage or even get out ahead of social inflation, not to mention also offer products to help their clients better navigate the risks. Since 2015, we've seen various litigations initiate: opioids, talc, glyphosate, paraquat, PFAS, climate, and the trend and casualty models have evolved dramatically over the last decade. So with capturing the right exposure data, reinsurers and insurers can understand their exposure to risks in litigation, as well as those that might be next, and make decisions using the insights, just like what we do on the Praedicat side. I do want to stress the importance of collecting good company identifiers for the accounts being written. Company really is the longitude and latitude of casualty. There is a ton of data surrounding companies, what they make, what they do, that can be used to assess the frequency and severity of liability. So by integrating a company identifier like DUNS or experience BIN number into the data standard, the process to map to external data sources becomes much easier and provides much more robust portfolio results that then allow the underwriters to make decisions off the information, which really kind of translates to the value of the data standard. Many internal liability models, such as pricing, use primary industry code to represent a company. But if you take a company like 3M, they operate in many different industries, and you might miss some of those sources of litigation risk. So it's so important to capture company. Our clients who run a portfolio analysis that includes current and all prior policy years, an indication of policy form such as occurrence or claims made, which has a large impact on the loss potential, and capture exclusions for specific, say, substances like PFAS, really do get the most robust estimates to steer their casualty portfolio. I think it's really exciting to see how this data standard could help the industry more generally be sustainable. With insurers having a better handle on their liability exposures, they're better able to spread the risk to reinsurers, potentially even on a more tailored basis, like what is done in property with specific perils like hurricane and earthquake cover. So with that, I'm pleased to support the standard, and thanks for having me today.
Thank you very much indeed, Jessica. And as I say, not least for standing in last minute, but also for a very early start as well for you in California. So much appreciated. I know that lots of you are joining from around the world. So wherever you are, thank you very much indeed. And please don't forget, if you've got a specific question for any of our panelists, there is the chat facility. It is open. Apart from Henry, I haven't seen anybody else make use of that just yet. So please don't be shy. Pop a question if you have one. So now into the detail, if you like, the approaches and the specifics. On the ODS liability side, I'd very much like to introduce Mathias Borjesson, who is SVP Corporate Risk at Renaissance. Mathias, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Jeremy. So I'm not going to extol the virtues of open data standards. I think that's been done, but I agree very much with everything that's been said so far. I think at Renaissance Re, we've long been championing or data standards, particularly open data standards. So for us, this is a natural extension of the work we have done with Oasis, and we're excited to see it to come to some degree of fruition here. But I'm not going to spend much on the sort of the importance aspect that's been covered. I want to give you a bit more a flavor of what the actual standard looks like and some of the decisions we took in designing this first version of it. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and I'll be grateful if someone tells me that they're not seeing what they're meant to be seeing. So if I do that, what I'm hoping people see is very much what Matt showed earlier, which is the location in GitHub. And
yeah, we can see that. That's fine.
Thank you. It's always a bit nervous around using Zoom instead of Teams. So I'm not going to go through the full rationale, but I would very much encourage people to go to the GitHub location and read it, because we did do quite a lot of thinking early on in terms of how can we actually progress this. We're, I think, painfully aware that the need for an open data standard, or just a standard in liability, has existed for a very long time, and it hasn't got off the ground. So how do we tackle that problem? And the approach we eventually settled on was to start small. So try to make the data standard as compact and as digestible as possible in an initial state, but with the potential then to sensibly expand it over time as usage increases. This will contrast a little bit to when you look at the OED for property, and the enormous wealth of information that that standard encourages to capture. This is trying to zero in on the bits that we absolutely need the industry to start capturing, and then hopefully we can expand from there. So I just want to set that scene. So if anyone expects to see 400 other fields here, they're going to be disappointed. It's all going to fit on a single screen in a minute. The other aspect that we had to decide on quite early on is the scope for liability. Liability is a huge bucket, as was mentioned by previous speakers. So we tried to put a framework around establishing that scope, and we ended up referencing EIOPA's, so a convention for business classification. But I don't want people to overemphasize that. I was just literally, we picked somewhere to start to have the conversation, and it helped us to have a framework already to refer to, just to agree what liability even means. But quite quickly, what we realized is that a lot of the stuff that's covered under EIOPA's definitions of liability are not of particular interest to us who work in the exposure management side of the business, who are interested in exposure accumulation and risk management, because it's just smaller risks, and they're risks that probably, even if we got the data, we wouldn't be able to sensibly accumulate. So a lot of that will be around the auto and motor lines of business, other types of vessel type insurances that you could have in marine and aviation, and also personal liability insurances, which exist in the US and UK markets to various degrees. They are not just less likely to be sources of material accumulation for a company who writes a lot of risks, but they're also fraught with difficulty around data sharing. Obviously, everyone here is very aware of GDPR and other related initiatives, and you probably cannot share all of the information that exists for the individual policyholders. And the risk characteristics of a insured person may not be something we want to share in the standard. So we started focusing on the more obvious company space. So legal entities, corporates, companies, and thinking about what lines of business do they get insurance for, and is there commonality? Can we get that under one umbrella? And we think we can to some extent when it comes to the data. So that's what you see on screen really, is the dark blue, which is the in-scope lines of business, and a lot of time was spent discussing what goes where and what should be called what. It wasn't straightforward. It's very unlikely we've got it spot on. But what we're trying to achieve here is a universally applicable taxonomy that could be understood by a US practitioner and a UK practitioner, a European practitioner, because they have all different naming conventions for what amounts to be very similar coverages. So we really have the 5 core buckets of liability coverage that we're focusing on. So management liability, which will include D&O, professional liability, which will include also things like medical malpractice, which is a professional liability cover for medical practitioners in the eyes of this schema. Transactional liability, so warranty, indemnity, or reps and warranties. And then commercial liability is a big one. A lot of us will know it as general liability, but we tried really hard to avoid saying general liability because that often becomes too general. So on a commercial liability, we have a lot of those GL coverages that you will see in the market. And then finally, EL or employer's liability, which we thought was a worthwhile separation. So that's what the standard was trying to accommodate in this first version, but there's definitely scope here for expansion and creation of a broader standard that covers other lines as well. If that's the taxonomy, then the other thing I'm going to do is swap into the actual schema itself in the field, so you can get that yourself by moving in the GitHub location here. And like I said, and I promised, you can bring it all on one screen, which we hope is going to make it more marketable and digestible. So I'm not going to go through each line by line. I don't think we have the time for that, or necessarily, I don't think people want to hear me talking for that long, but I'll talk briefly about the categories and the ideas behind the fields that are in there, and also the relative levels of priority that we have in the first pass assigned. So in terms of categories of data, we see it really as these 4 categories. So you have information around the policyholder, and a lot of that will be focused on, I think it was mentioned by several people, the identification of the policyholder. It's a bit different, in my opinion, to what may be the case in property. Once you have your lat longs, I think the identification is sort of taken care of. There's actually a lot of work going here. There's a lot of technologies that could be leveraged, to Robin's point, to help with this, but you will need to provide something. So too often we don't get anything that we can use as a reinsurer, getting lots of submission data from the market. Too often we don't get anything at all that we can use to identify who's actually being insured here. So there's a range of options here that could help the identification. Also in the policyholder category are some of the risk attributes. Now the OED for property will be very rich in this respect, around building codes, occupancy codes, etc. We have started quite small. I think Robin already mentioned them. So employee accounts and revenue, as well as the industry, which we think could be a very useful risk characteristic to pivot on. But there's undoubtedly scope for more here in terms of how you describe liability risk. And I would like, and I would very much welcome people to suggest expansions to the schema in this respect about what are useful risk attributes to be capturing and pivoting off when you analyze liability risk. And they may be line of business specific, and maybe they don't work for those 5 major lines that we focused on here, but there's nothing to stop the creation of satellite schemas or sub-schemas or building out the structure in some way. But we want to start with something that's quite generic and works across effectively all 5 of those lines that we talked about. The other categories, coverage is extremely important to understand, starting with just can we all agree what to call things, which is the ODS liability class attempt. But actually completely essential for use of the schema is that there is a description of coverage provided by whoever uses it. So again, too often we get nonsensical descriptions of coverage, which don't even relate to a line of business or any terms and conditions in the policy, but could be an internal coding convention that's an abstract layer. And we need to move away from that as an industry. We need to always be able to describe what is being covered, who is being covered. And some of the other fields around that will obviously help us understand coverage, like what basis does the contract trigger, et cetera, what dates are being covered, is defense costs covered or not. The more standard stuff, which I think a lot of people overlook, is the policy financial terms. Now, maybe you have to be as close to data as I am to really understand how bad this is, but almost all of us will be using different names for the same thing when it comes to describing these things. And very often it's impossible to even guess. So if someone uses the word excess, I don't actually know if they mean a policy deductible or if they mean that it's part of the tower and it's an attachment point. And that prolongs the whole conversation with the broker and the client. We have to go back and ask that question. We have to get clarification and so on. The value chain sort of breaks down a little bit there, in my opinion, and we should just be able to understand that straight off the bat. So people shouldn't underestimate the importance of capturing this in structured data format and the benefit it could have, particularly on pricing teams who deal with this on sort of daily basis. And then finally, very importantly, again, in the liability space, especially for these lines of business, it's characterized heavily by co-insurance. So we need to know what the participation is for the particular risk that is being presented. And everything above is actually not participant specific, if you think about it. Ideally, 2 companies sharing the same risk will have exactly the same data for all of those 3 categories. and they only differ in what share that they've taken of that particular policy. Nuances will exist, but that's the concept, that we will categorize the participant as a separate category, and the share being a completely essential part of that. So are you 100% of this, or are you 10%? Again, we don't get to see that very often. So that's all I want to say around the structure. You can see for yourself that we have provided field descriptions. We try to be as prescriptive as possible, following some market feedback. We started with a more generic template, but we iterated increasingly towards more prescription to provide as much clarity and as much reference data as possible to the user. So you can follow some of these links to see definitions. There's ISO references, and there's also actually within this template itself a hopefully helpful list of the latest industry codes as published by the various industry bodies, country codes as they're frequently used, they'll be similar in property, and currency codes same there. So we're hoping that will give people a real head start in terms of populating the schema in a consistent way. But I think the absolute key thing is for us the adoption of the structure and the content being shared. And that's my last thing to say. I apologize if I'm running a little bit over time here, which is this grading of priority. Now, you should not take that as a hard rule, but we try to explain what we, as market practitioners at least, see as completely essential for this to be useful versus what we really want people to do. So we separated those things out. So if you look at the essential fields, you're down to a very, very small schema. It almost looks like we're not being too ambitious enough. But my earlier comments apply. We don't get this. In fact, it's more often than not that we don't get all of these fields, which is actually quite shocking as a state of the market. So I think defining something that's completely essential for us to even understand what the risk is helpful in my opinion. And this name or some type of description of who's insured is part of that. If you go into the highly recommended category, it's stuff that we really think people should be capturing. But if you have the name, to Robin's point, we can actually find a lot of this. Or people can license solutions that are available, third-party providers that can enrich your data on the back of that name. But it's much better would be that the market provides it, and we can all have the view without having to incur that operational expense and inefficiency of enriching it. Lots of us do exactly the same thing. Why are we doing that? Can we stop doing that? But a lot of the stuff here, you'll see, and apologies if you've seen this little blocker, actually falls under Lloyd's minimum standards. So those of you who operate in the Lloyd's market, this is probably much more aligned to what Lloyd's would be expecting as a minimum standard. And it's actually a step beyond than what we think is strictly essential for the schema to be used. I'm not going to talk about the others, but there's also a recommended category, which I guess goes a little bit further into the stuff that would help us identify companies and understand the cover, but probably not at the same level of importance as some of the previous fields we talked about. And finally, there's some optional fields, which are really optional in the sense that they don't apply to all risks. So we put them in there because they apply to lots of them, but not all of them. Those are the levels of priority that we sort of started with. But really from here on, what we're hoping is to have lots and lots of people engage with this, give us feedback on what works, what doesn't work, what fields are missing, or is anything misclassified or could be done better. Feedback of any nature, really, because I would say that the work to date has been really good, but it's been quite a small core group that's been pushing this forward. And I know there's a lot of opinions out there. There's a lot of useful feedback that we haven't been able to solicit. So I really hope that this first version, as useful as I think it is in its own right, is the start of a much larger industry collaboration in this space. That was me. Thank you, Jeremy. Sorry for running a bit over on my slot.
You did not run over at all, because I think you've brought terrific clarity into this. Thank you for bringing it to life as well as you've done. Apologies to everyone. There have been some direct messages to me in terms of people trying to ask some questions. I think, Mathias, you've really covered such a great amount of that. But I still think one of these is worthwhile sort of repeating. Firstly, how mature, robust do you consider this standard as of today? And since standards unfold their value only with broad market adoption, where do you think the ODS liability stands in this regard?
Jeremy, can you just say the beginning of that again? Because certainly I missed the first sentence, I think.
Yeah, I think it's more about how mature, robust do you consider this standard to be today? I mean, clearly for us today, this is a launch. It's just the beginning. So I think that's really the answer.
I mean, I can comment quickly, I guess, and how we would view it by comparison to the data that's currently being circulated in the market. So we receive thousands of submissions from different clients as a global reinsurer. And I would say this standard would represent the gold standard of a submission that you may see in the market. In fact, I don't think any submission has all of this data. I don't think we necessarily expect people to populate all of this data. But if you are populating this data, you can be rest assured that it's better than anything that's actually being circulated at the moment. So in that sense, I think it's a robust starting place to define what is, in a way, current best practice, and then maybe start pushing that a little bit in the direction of more standardization, more prescription, more consistency in how we actually populate that data. Jeremy, you're on mute.
Sorry, classic. Thank you very much indeed, Mathias. So there are a couple more questions coming through. Yes, if you have a specific question, please send a direct message to one of the speakers, or myself, or to Dickie, or to Matt. And if we don't have a chance to get to it today, we'll certainly follow up with you. I think one of the main questions seems to be is, what are the barriers to the market adopting these data standards? David, I think you partially answered that, but would any of the panelists like to unmute and just respond as to what you think the barriers are and how we can move forward?
I'll probably jump in just quickly. I think one of the barriers, and we've discussed this on many of the calls during the working groups while we developed the schema, was getting the model providers, not just the model providers, but also users of this schema, to get the schema to be consumed by those products that they're using on a modeling perspective. So how do you get that ODS specific data into those models? And Robin did allude to it about mapping and some conversion tools, or something that can be, people have their own internal templates of this that they then will change, or Arium or Praedicat will change to get into their own tools. So if there's a way for those companies to be able to consume or easily map from the ODS into those tools, I think that would be one of the big hurdles. So the data is more usable from the get-go, really.
I've got a couple of technical questions here coming through, and the one I like is anyone actually using this in anger yet? Well, I think the frustration and anger is that you shame me by my age when you showed Mathias the latest version of NAICS you're using. When I tried to get this sorted, I think it was the 2002 or 2007 version of NAICS. So yes, we are angry, and yes, we want people to start using this. But the question I've got is there something like an open source implementation available, either SQL or DB schemas and Sonally, that can be used? I think you have got some technical questions like this. First answer is please write to Matt, and also go on to GitHub. You'll find an awful lot more detail there. Matt, do you want to take that one though?
Yeah. I'm happy to just to answer that quickly. So you mentioned SQL now, from a property cat modeling industry, property focus, obviously we all know SQL Server, and it is very much still used a lot in the industry. With open data standards generally across whatever lines of business we're talking about, property or liability or non-property, we know it's not going away, but it's using a SQL Server or a proprietary database format. It's not something we're looking to support too much of or encourage too much of, just because it is a proprietary technology, and it's not something that we necessarily want to push for open data standards. For property, we started using a Parquet format from Excel, which takes CSV and put into Parquet, and that's an open source data format. If people want to use this liability schema for more machine readable purposes, and to get into, I don't know, APIs or some kind of interoperable system they have internally, then there's plenty of open source formats out there, which we don't endorse one or support one. It's all open source, so you can choose. But I think just from the ODS perspective, we don't want to be saying we're going to put it on SQL or we're going to put it on these other proprietary things, just because the nature of ODS, I don't think that's the best thing to do.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Emma, I'm going to try your internet connection again, if that's okay. So incoming. Finally, with things like Lloyd's minimum data standards, how can the industry push brokers and cedents to supply this format? Thank you very much indeed, Douglas, for that question.
Really difficult question to answer. I guess softly and over time is probably the only answer I have to that. You know, we can't force people to use it, but we can certainly encourage people to use it. And I know that, you know, the team that have put this together have worked really closely with brokers, so brokers should be on board with it. I don't know, 20 years ago, we used to, you know, treaty underwriters, property underwriters used to say, well, if we can't have the data, then we might not consider underwriting your risk. And, you know, in certain market conditions, you can get away with that. And maybe under certain, you know, those market conditions may come along and we may be able to start doing that in the market. But otherwise, I think it's just going to have to be a long, hard slog to keep working at it.
I think that's absolutely right. It is going to be a long, hard slog. And Lauren, thank you for your question. Great to see you on. This is not just applicable for the UK market. This is a standard for the world. To infinity and beyond is where we're going. And in talking in terms of long, hard slogs, Mr. COVID himself, Dickie, you stayed with us, and thank you, because I know you're not feeling terrifically well. You've got 1 minute to tell us about the next steps. And don't forget about the 20th of April on cyber.
Perfect, because my voice might last about that long. So first of all, I want to say thank you very much to everybody. I mean, particularly Matt, who led the efforts on the OASIS team, who's done a great job, but also to everybody in the marketplace that has worked so hard over the last 12 months to make this work. These things only work as a community initiative. So thank you all. I think I also want to say that actually it's really that the next steps are really important. So if there's anybody on this call, or indeed anybody who is connected with somebody on this call that feels they can become part of a new steering group, technical steering group around this, please later on let yourself be known, because that's going to be part of making the next steps work as we develop this over time. And as you've already alluded to, Jeremy, we've got the launch of the starting process for cyber standards coming up in a couple of weeks. You want to know about that, let us know. We're in Bermuda on April the 26th. If you're in Bermuda, come along, please. We've got 9 CAT modeling companies in Bermuda to sell their wares. And lastly, to the question about, you know, how do we make this work? Is anybody using it? Well, the answer is there's a number of big firms on this call, and I don't want to call out too many, people like Allianz and Zurich and RenRe and the big brokers who have basically said, we need to do this as a marketplace. We are going to start using it. And that's how these things actually happen. So if your firm isn't doing so right now, then you've got to just do it. It really is that sort of simple. Roll up one's sleeves and get into it. And I know there's a lot of work, and I know it takes time. And there are firms that have done this before. That's what we need to do. It's not for OASIS we're doing this. We don't even have any models in OASIS from liability right now. This is a market initiative for the market, for you. So please do use it. So thank you very much. It's been great. Well done, organized. Jeremy, back to you.
Well, I think that's it. Just to close it out, anyone who's asked a question, we will have a note of it and we'll come back to you separately. There will also be a recording of this made available in due course, plus all the questions will be answered in the fullness of time. Once more, just to thank all the speakers, you were absolutely terrific. And thank you all for attending. Great show, great attendance, and let's start using it. Have a good afternoon, everybody.